Welcome back as we continue to look back at D-Day on this, the 75th anniversary of the Allied invasion of Normandy. Already tonight, we've looked at the military and political aspects of that day. In this segment, we're going to look at its place in history, as well as the roles of some of its most important figures. For that, presidential historian Robert Dallek joins me now. Robert is the author of Franklin Roosevelt, A Political Life, as well as The Lost Peace, which covers post-war Europe, and frankly, too many other titles to mention. Robert, D-Day and the Second World War, there are two U.S. presidents in starring roles. There was, of course, the commander-in-chief at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, and also Dwight Eisenhower, who became president later, who was Supreme Allied Commander for the war. I'm wondering which of them comes to your mind first when you think back on both D-Day and the Second World War?
Well, first I think of Franklin Roosevelt because he was a storied president. He had already been president for 11 years by then, and the longest serving president in American history. And he had led the country through the Great Depression, and here we were on the verge of winning World War II, and this had been the greatest struggle for the United States in a foreign war in its history. And Eisenhower, of course, had a major role, but he nowhere near at that point had the kind of standing and fame that Franklin Roosevelt enjoyed. And of course, it was added to by the fact that Roosevelt was associated with what was known as the Big Three, Churchill, Stalin, and FDR.
Roosevelt, of course, prosecuted this war, having led, as you mentioned, the nation through the Great Depression, but also dealing with his own physical limitations. And as we would find out just a few years after the invasion, as he was approaching the end of his life, to your mind, does that make his leadership for D-Day and during the Second World War that much more impressive, that he could do all this and meet with those foreign leaders despite his own failings?
Yeah, it was really quite extraordinary because he met with Stalin and Churchill at Yalta in February 1945, and he was already a dying man. He had a condition that would do him in by April. And in fact, when he ran again in 1944 for the presidency, he was already quite ill. But the country wanted to keep him in power as long as the war was going on. He understood that if the war were over, he would not have been elected to a fourth term in 1944. And in fact, when he came back from Yalta and spoke to a joint session of the Congress, he said that I know you will excuse me for sitting down, for I returned from a journey of 14,000 miles, and I carry 10 pounds of steel around each of my lower limbs. It's the only time in his presidency he ever made reference to his disability.
Roosevelt clearly saw the war coming before a lot of Americans did, tried to prepare the nation for it, even before the U.S. entered the war in 1941. But I'm wondering, in your research of him, any reticence on his part about ordering the D-Day invasion, 156,000 Allied soldiers and 10,000 casualties. No president wants to look at those daunting numbers. Was he enthusiastic about D-Day? Was he looking for other ways out? What do we know?
Well, what we know is that this was the culmination of the fighting against the Nazis. And they were confident that they were going to win that fighting. Not overconfident, because they knew it was going to cause losses and suffering. But they understood that this was essential, that they commanded the air at that point, and the Nazi air forces had been largely decimated. And therefore, when Nazi troops or armor tried to come up to the shore, to the front, the air attack would deter them. And so he understood, Churchill understood, and of course it was also essential in their dealings with Stalin, because the Soviets had sacrificed so much. They lost 25 million people in that conflict. But Churchill and Roosevelt were concerned that they also should have a military presence on the continent, since Stalin was expanding, captured Eastern Europe, and was moving toward Berlin. And they wanted to be sure that the British and American forces were on the continent too.
Let's shift over to Dwight Eisenhower. He, of course, was Supreme Allied Commander for D-Day and for the European theater in the Second World War. So it's his invasion. He gets the credit for it. But do we know how directly involved in the planning and the prosecution of D-Day he was, or was he the manager who worked with all of the different component parts?
Well, I would say both. He certainly had to work with and dealing with his allies, who, of course, at that point were mainly the British, the Canadians, but also the French. And these were delicate matters. But he was also very much involved in the planning. But of course, at the forefront of this was also General George C. Marshall, who was in Washington. And Marshall would have preferred to have gone to England to command the invasion. But Roosevelt insisted that he stay in Washington because he saw him as such a reliable military aide and advisor. And so it was a collaborative effort. Indeed, what's difficult for people nowadays, with the country so at sixes and sevens, so divided, to imagine that there was so much unity and a coherence in the country between the two parties and between all or among all Americans, as they determined to win that war and combat and defeat Nazism, fascism, and Japanese militarism.
You mentioned divisiveness in our politics today. I think it's amazing that in 1952, when he ran for president, Americans didn't know if Dwight Eisenhower was a Democrat or a Republican. Both parties wanted to draft him to be their standard bearer. He wound up being elected as a Republican. I'm curious for your thoughts about that, but then also whether the lessons learned by Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower colored the experiences and the decisions that future President Eisenhower would make.
Well, the answer to both points is yes, that he guarded himself from partisanship. He was a general. He should be above the political battles. And Truman, 48, had urged Eisenhower to run for president in his place. And Eisenhower didn't want to do it. And then in 52, he took on the task because we were locked in the Cold War, and he believed that it was essential for someone who knew a great deal about military affairs to command the country at that point. And remember, this is the point in 52 when the United States is locked into the Korean War. And he learned a great deal from being a commander in the field when it came to being president, because when he ran for president, he promised to go to Korea as a kind of promise of ending the Korean War, which Americans were intensely concerned about and eager to have happen. He flew, once he was elected, he flew to Korea, and he flew over the lines dividing the North and South Korean forces and the Chinese and American forces along the 38th parallel. And he saw the way in which the Chinese and the North Koreans were dug in, and he was being pressed by Republican senators to launch an offensive, and he wouldn't do it because he was concerned that, as in World War I, there would be a certain folly to this, that it would cost the United States and its allies great numbers of troops. And so what he did was, behind the scenes, threatened the Chinese with bombing using atomic bombs, and it frightened them into returning to the negotiating table and ending the war. So he learned a great deal from being commander in the field.
Before I let you go, Robert, I want to ask you about the Marshall Plan, our plan for rebuilding Europe and helping to rebuild Europe after the Second World War came to a close. And it was something that Roosevelt certainly envisioned and Eisenhower helped continue as president. But I'm wondering, is there any historical precedent for that, for the victorious side in such a massive conflict coming to the aid of victims of both sides from the war and helping everybody find a footing? And was that a lesson built on the disaster that happened after the First World War, which a lot of people think led Germany right back into a wartime footing?
You're quite right. What Roosevelt struggled to do during the Second World War was to assure not only that we won a military victory, but that the United States emerged from the war in a mood to participate in post-war international affairs. The lessons of the post-World War I period were quite stark at that point. The idea that we had reverted to isolationism and to something in the 1930s called America First, which proved to be a terrible mistake in that it allowed the Nazis and the fascists in Italy and the Japanese military to run riot because they were not concerned about the United States because it was so isolationist. And Roosevelt was determined that at the end of the war, we should be prepared to participate in post-war international affairs.
Robert Dallek is a presidential historian and an author, and we thank you, sir, for helping to color our coverage of this D-Day anniversary with your insight. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And up next, we'll whip around our area and look at how local communities are celebrating D-Day's 75th anniversary.